Tim Miller, let me start with you on the Arnold Palmer of all this. This is the Palm Beach Post reporting on Arnold Palmer's daughter. And what Arnold Palmer's daughter says Arnold Palmer would think of Donald Trump today. Quote, I think he'd cringe. Quote, my dad didn't like people who act like they're better than other people, Peg Palmer said. Quote, he had no patience for people who are dishonest and cheat. My dad was disciplined. He wanted to be a good role model. He was appalled by Trump's lack of civility and what he began to see as Trump's lack of character. Peg Palmer recalls one moment when her father saw Trump on television during the 2016 presidential campaign. Quote, one moment stands out in my mind, she said. My dad and I were home in Latrobe. He died in September, so this was before the election. The television was on, Trump was talking, and my dad made a sound of disgust, like uck or ugh, like he couldn't believe the arrogance and crudeness of this man, who was the nominee of the political party that he believed in. Then he said, quote, he's not as smart as we thought he was, and walked out of the room. What would my dad think of Donald Trump today? I think he'd cringe. Let me show you this also before we deal with Arnold Palmer, because it has some significance in terms of what the Trump base thinks they're getting with Donald Trump. Here's CNN interviewing. This is Jake Tapper's interview with Speaker Mike Johnson, who's simply put on the spot about Trump's public closing argument.
Is this really the closing message you want voters to hear from Donald Trump? Stories about Arnold Palmer's penis?
Well, listen, I think that the headline that I read about the rally in Pennsylvania yesterday was the big question, and it's the one that Kamala Harris has not been able or willing to answer, and that is, are you better off now than you were under the Trump administration 4 years ago?
Why is he talking about Arnold Palmer's penis in front of Pennsylvania voters?
Jake, you seem to like that line a lot. Let me tell you that Donald Trump is doing rallies nonstop around the country.
Let me just say something. I don't want to be talking about this.
Right.
Donald Trump is out there saying it. It is.
But you continue to. Let's talk about.
Because you won't address
Wait a minute.
it.
Hold on.
You won't address it. He is out there talking to voters.
No, I'll address it. Let me answer it. Okay, don't say it again. We don't have to say it. I get it. There's lines in a rally. When President Trump is at a rally, sometimes he'll speak for 2 straight hours. You're questioning his stamina, his mental acuity. Joe Biden couldn't do that for 5 minutes. That's how you started this segment. You said, what if Biden was in a rally like that? He couldn't fill the room. Donald Trump does. You know why? Because they see him as a change agent, and they understand he has a record of performance.
So, I mean, I didn't realize Mike Johnson also can't get over that Joe Biden, for the good of the party and the good of our democracy, is off the ticket. Clearly, he's in that category. But the reason it's important, even to the Trump voter, is because he is waving a red flag in front of the country in these final 16 days, saying, look how batshit crazy I can be. And to Vaughn's very important, very substantive reporting, he can make 30 of 50 Trump voters believe he won a state he lost by 5 million votes. And so the reason this is important is if you've already voted for Trump, I think God will forgive you. But if you haven't made that mistake yet, he's making a fool of you. He's making a fool of you, and he thinks you want to hear him weave, as he says, and talk about Arnold Palmer's penis as a metaphor for his virility. But again, I was in a sorority, and the only men who ever talk about the size of anyone's penis are the ones who are projecting some insecurity about their own. So here we are, 16 days to go, and this is Donald Trump's message to his base.
Yeah, I think there are two elements of this that I think are really important, Nicole. I agree with what you said there. One is just like this notion of manhood, and this is important in the final days of the campaign because both campaigns are saying they're speaking to younger men, and I think that's a swing demographic. And I think that was just very telling about what Donald Trump thinks about when he thinks of manhood and the contrast between him and Arnold Palmer as told by his daughter, right? That for Donald Trump, like being a real man is bragging about the size of his Arnold Palmer's 3-wood or whatever. Like that's it. Like that's what being a real man is to Donald Trump, right? He's probably overcompensating for something. But like there was a period of time when we were growing up where like the traits of manhood, of being a real man, are all these traits Donald Trump doesn't have, right? Like integrity, humility, loyalty, right? The strong silent type, if you will, right? That's not Donald Trump in any way. All those traits that Arnold Palmer and men of his generation had, none of them are like Trump. And Trump's selling this kind of vulgar knockoff version of manhood since he doesn't have any of those traits of genuine manhood. And so I do think that's a message that hopefully can get through to, some young men who are on the fence and are looking at Donald Trump and seeing him and being told that he is some symbol of manhood, which he isn't. The other thing, though, I would say that makes this very relevant, and Mike Johnson's discomfort there and his campaign's discomfort, is that regardless of what you think about Donald Trump's cognitive, as he called it, of his own mental health, like this guy has no guardrails on him, right? There's no consultant, there's no smart group of people around him that's like, we really think you should talk about Arnold Palmer and, this weekend, right? Like, he's not on message, he's not controllable. So whether he's just an out-of-control crazy person or whether he's mentally declining, think about that 4 years from now. Project that out to an 82-year-old Donald Trump with no one around him able to control him, with the nuclear codes in the White House, surrounded by Mike Lindell and Rudy or whoever's still around then. That's a very scary prospect. I think if you look at the man we saw this weekend, it's scary enough, but projected out 4 years, and I think that should be alarming to anybody who's not yet voted that's thinking about what to do.
Tim, I used to say that where we are is that the Republican Party will say everything's fine as long as Donald Trump hasn't taken out his pee-pee and played with it on TV. We're there. I mean, he's talking about Arnold Palmer's penis on TV at his rallies from a podium. Again, not an investigative piece, not a story about how uninhibited he is behind the scenes, but a story about what he's doing at a podium in a battleground state, in an election where, in his view, in his telling, his own freedom could be on the line. It's uncomfortable. It's disgusting. It is literally one of the two choices before voters in 16 days.